In this video, I'm going to share my process along with 5 fundamental tips that I've learned for painting large with acrylics. As tempting as it may be to just start by putting your brush on the canvas and start painting, it really is essential to have a plan and process in mind ahead of time. Painting large is a completely different animal than painting in a sketchbook or a smaller size on your desk. So it's important that your initial sketch, whether that be via transfer paper or projection, is sound and reflects your plan. That way, as you paint, all you have to do is focus on plugging in colors. So you'll see me here making sure that my sketch is up to my standard before I cover it with a transparent gesso. The transparent gesso will lock in my sketch underneath, and it makes an excellent base coat for my paint that's going to be sitting directly on top. If you're using something like a canvas, they typically come pre-primed so you don't have to do this step. I personally prefer painting on wood. This piece in particular is a commissioned piece of art for a multifamily housing unit I'm doing all of their art for, so I had to submit a pre-designed digital composition. So this I compiled from different references I found, I painted some. It's kind of like a hodgepodge of different things, but that's what I'm going to be using to paint this large painting from. I think it's always important to have a couple references in front of you when you are working large. It's fairly obvious that if you're painting really large, it's helpful to have a large area to paint, but you don't necessarily need a giant art room to paint a large piece. What I tend to do is paint larger pieces in multi-panels that can be hung together to create a larger piece. It also helps to have tables that fold down. Having a studio where you can really move stuff around helps me out, especially if you're the type of artist that works on multiple projects at a time. Having something like a drop cloth and extra rags on hand is very helpful. Another thing to consider is different sized brushes. You're going to need pretty large brushes depending on how large you're going to be painting, and then you'll move down in size for the smaller details. I find that a palette knife is really nice for mixing large batches of color. And before you begin painting, it is a great time to take inventory over what paint colors you're going to be using. I find it's best to set aside a palette that I've curated ahead of time to make sure that when I revisit this piece at my next painting session, I can easily mix the same colors again. As far as your studio prep goes, make sure you also have plenty of room around yourself so you're able to access all your paints and brushes and everything with ease. You want plenty of room to be able to get up and move around, as stepping back and changing your perspective is a very important aspect of painting large. When we paint something small, we're able to see it all at the same time, but when we're painting large, we're painting in sections. So it's very important that you're taking time to step back every once in a while and check that your painting is overall looking how you want it to. If you watched my last video, then you have already heard me talk about painting portraits upside down and how it's beneficial to just reassess all your values and proportions and everything. Well, the same goes for acrylic. You can use it the exact same way. For me, it's most beneficial in the beginning stages when I'm just starting to block in my colors. On that note of proportions and making sure everything is correct and double checking, I just wanted to share with you a big mistake that I made on mine. I checked everything side to side for my transfer, but I didn't check up and down. So the neck is not aligned between panels. So now what I'm going to do is just redraw the neck. If there was a background color, it'd be really simple to just paint over it, but there's not. So I'm going to sand it down to the original wood grain. If this was a smaller painting, this definitely wouldn't happen, but because it's so large, it's really hard to like arrange the panels vertically, because it's 8 feet worth of artwork, and I don't really have a large easel to support that. So essentially, I'm just using sandpaper. I start coarse, then medium, then light. As my final step for getting rid of the mistake, I'm just going to recoat the area in transparent gesso. Definitely let it dry and add a second coat on there. So once that was fixed, I was ready to start painting again, and alas, another important lesson learned the hard way in double checking your proportions more times than you think you might need to. It might save you 2 hours of time and a handful of sandpaper. Another way you can change your perspective is by changing the location of your painting. I know it's a pain if it's a large piece to carry it outside, but I do this all the time with my artwork. I take it outside of my studio in the natural light so that I can see what's going on with it and how the colors look in a different light. The reason why changing your perspective is so important is because it allows you to evaluate what you need to do. If you're not sure what changes you need to make, this next tip will be very important for you. After a long session of painting, I will just snap a photo of the piece in its current state, move it over to my iPad, and on my iPad, I will kind of adjust the composition until it looks right. I'll find all the mistakes that I'm not happy with, and it will give me a game plan for next time I need to paint. Painting large can be very expensive, but you can negate some of that loss by making sure you know how to manage your paints. Start by putting out a little bit less paint than you think you may need to, and I find it helpful to add a little bit of a retarder into the paint, and that's an acrylic medium that will help extend the drying time. There are a multitude of different acrylic mediums you can use to help extend your paint as well. The less paint you use, in some instances, the more cost effective it will be. I personally use glazing liquid, but there are a lot of different options that will make your paint do different things. If you're going to be painting for a long session, acrylic paint can form a paint skin over the top of your palette. So what I do is just use a palette knife to remove any paint that is salvageable and switch over to a new sheet. I really admire palette paper for this because it keeps cleanup pretty simple and I can manage the longevity of my paint. The final piece of advice that I'd like to give you is to paint fearlessly. Acrylic paint is so forgiving, and if it doesn't come out right, you can just paint over it once it dries. So just remember to use your arms at their full movement when carrying through strokes to get some more beautiful gestural layers in your painting. And know that mistakes are going to happen. Don't be afraid to make them. If you see a problem area, then immediately address it and try to fix it. There's no benefit to playing it safe if you're painting this large. The mistake will always bother you. Something that helps me paint fearlessly is knowing that I have a plan and I know what my next step is going to be and what I need to do to make myself happy with what I'm painting. So I am briefly just going to touch on my process for acrylics. It really has to do with just bringing the piece all up at the same time. And essentially what that means is you're not going to add your detail at the beginning of the painting, but rather the end. When you're painting big, it's really easy to get carried away with plugging in details early, but trust me, it's going to be a lost cause most of the time because you end up changing things in relation to the other objects around it. So I start really loose and I build up my layers and I get tighter as I go. Kind of like how I do my mixed media watercolor if you've watched my other videos. This is just a personal preference. Of course, there's a bunch of different ways that you can paint, but I find that this works really well for me. I'm able to get a lot of movement in my painting in those early layers, and then as I go, I'm able to refine. Another great way to have less stress and expectations on you while you paint is to just try to paint the painting to about 80% completion and then put it off to the side for about a month or two. Then, when you revisit it, you'll have fresh eyes, you'll have that change of perspective, and you'll be able to finish up the painting. That way you don't have to feel like it has to be perfect by the time you're done with it. You can kind of paint knowing that you may make some changes to it at a later date. Painting large is always a daunting task. It's so much work, and everybody can see every little detail you have in a very large size. So I understand why some people definitely have a hard time getting their head around painting something so big. But if you've never done it before, it's a really fun experience, and I definitely recommend for everybody to try it at least once. Thanks so much for watching my video. It's a little bit different than what I normally do, so please do let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed this one. I hope that this helped in some way, and I also hope that you have a wonderful week.